The Clone Wars is a series of conflicts lasting 3 years that take place in between Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith. The Clone Wars was an idea George Lucas wanted to incorporate into the Star Wars universe as far back as his early drafts for the first film. The wars are mentioned twice in A New Hope, once during Luke and Obi-Wan's conversation concerning Anakin.
You fought in the Clone Wars?
Yes. I was once a Jedi Knight, the same as your father.
And secondly in Leia's transmission to Obi-Wan.
General Kenobi, years ago you served my father in the Clone Wars. Now he begs you to help him in his struggle against the Empire.
Despite the numerous titles of Star Wars books that have been written over the years, George Lucas did not allow books to be written about the Clone Wars before the prequel trilogy was wrapped up. Because of this, fans spent many years speculating what they might be and whom they might involve. Early concepts for the Clone Wars referenced in The Empire Strikes Back included the possibility of Lando Calrissian being a clone from the wars, and even Boba Fett being a sole survivor from the battalion of shock troopers wiped out by the Jedi Knights during the conflict. Needless to say, none of this ever made it into the Star Wars universe, and instead fans eventually saw the rise of the Clone Wars in Attack of the Clones. But by the time Revenge of the Sith released, the story was already set in the waning days of the war, leaving the vast majority of the war unexplored. Now, if you're watching this, you're probably a Star Wars fan, and if you're a fan, you're probably well aware there's a 3D animated TV series called Star Wars: The Clone Wars, which shows multiple story arcs during this 3-year period in the Star Wars universe. But that isn't the only show that ever explored the Clone Wars, and actually, it isn't even the first. From 2003 to 2005, there was a show called Star Wars: Clone Wars, an animated TV series that, like the newer series, debuted on Cartoon Network. It was co-written and directed by Genndy Tartakovsky, creator of famous Cartoon Network shows like Dexter's Laboratory and Samurai Jack. If you were a kid at this time like me, you were seeing this just a year after Attack of the Clones hit theaters. The nature of the series was vastly different than the Clone Wars you're probably familiar with. For one, there are only 25 episodes which are split into 2 volumes. The first volume consists of 20 episodes, ranging anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes long. The second volume consisted of the other 5 episodes, this time each being 15 minutes long. Unlike the newer Clone Wars series, this show really only focused on a few key characters, mostly Anakin, Obi-Wan, and Padme. Its last episode also directly led into the opening of Revenge of the Sith, so if you were watching this in preparation for Revenge of the Sith, you had different eyes to see that movie with than those who didn't. But why 2 Clone Wars series? Well, the first show had 2 main roles. For one, it played as a sort of pilot to the 3D animated show that later came after it. And secondly, it amassed continual interest in the eventual release of Revenge of the Sith. Some of you may ask, which one is better? And while I'm sure there's a wealth of differing opinions on that matter, I think it's important to recognize that these 2 shows play in 2 different ways, though similar in some instances. Star Wars: Clone Wars is no longer canon unlike the 3D series, which is a shame given the fact that there are truly some interesting gems to be found in that series. So let's go through some of them. As said before, this series focuses heavily on Anakin and Obi-Wan, and reveals some pretty interesting things about their relationship as master and apprentice during the war. Between the 2 volumes, we do see a shift in the headstrong and arrogant Padawan side of Anakin to the honorable and disciplined Jedi Knight status he gains. In fact, there's a really interesting scene in which we see Anakin knighted, whereby his Padawan braid is severed. This look into the lore of the Jedi Knights was interesting to see, given that there wasn't much said in the movies about how the ranking in the order necessarily worked. The series introduces us to General Grievous as well, who is actually a Jedi murdering machine in this series. He speaks with a smooth but metallic voice, and spreads fear in most every Jedi he faces. We also see how he got his cough and crippled, cowardly status we see in Revenge of the Sith, as his chest is crushed by Mace Windu. In Revenge of the Sith, we also hear Grievous say,
"Fool! I've been trained in your Jedi arts by Count Dooku!"
and we actually do get to see that in this series. We're also introduced to Asajj Ventress, a character very present in the newer 3D series. In the original, we find out she was discovered and subsequently trained by Count Dooku. She battles Anakin on the moon of Yavin 4 in one of the most incredible lightsaber fights in the series. What this series does well is show how war is rampant seemingly in every corner of the galaxy, and how involved the Jedi Knights we see in the background of the films are in these huge battles. Anakin's descent into darkness is also played very well in this series, and definitely preps you going into Revenge of the Sith. Speaking of going into Revenge of the Sith, we're shown the exact events that led to the opening rescue mission in that movie through this series. We see how Grievous kidnapped the Chancellor, and where Obi-Wan and Anakin were during that time. For a lot of people, this was our look into the Clone Wars before the 3D series took over, so it's a little sad that the series was unfortunately scrapped as a whole. Despite that, I think there is a sort of viewing order that could place this series into your headcanon if you wished. As stated before, this series is separated into 2 volumes, and there does appear to be a time jump after Anakin is knighted, which leads us into the mission that spills into the beginning of Revenge of the Sith. In this time jump, both Anakin and Obi-Wan don the same appearances they have in the newer series. Now you may know that the newer series was abruptly cancelled after being purchased by Disney, leaving no conclusion for the show. While it is true that the show had plans to wrap with a siege on Mandalore, this was all later put in the book Ahsoka. If you're not keen on reading, you're probably not aware of that, and if viewing is easier for you, then here's how this viewing order works. In your own head canon, you could assume that in between the 2 volumes of the original Clone Wars series, the newer series in its entirety takes place. That would mean that you watch Volume 1 of the Clone Wars, then you insert the 3D series, and then you finish with the second volume of Clone Wars. There are minor plot holes and inconsistencies with this, but nothing so jarring as to suspend your belief. In this way, both series can be appreciated for what they bring to the table, thereby enhancing your viewing of Revenge of the Sith even more. Aside from 2 TV series, this era also brought about some pretty great video games as well, including the Star Wars Battlefront 2 from 2005, a game by the name Star Wars The Clone Wars released just after Episode 2 came out, and my personal favorite, Republic Commandos. These games do a good job of showcasing what the soldiers' views were during the war, and not necessarily the Jedi. The Clone Wars is important because in many ways it was the catalyst that pushed the evolution of the Republic into the empire of the original trilogy. This was an era ripe for storytelling, and eventually we got just that in a lot of ways. Hopefully you learned more about the ways this time period was explored, and maybe a new viewing order for yourself. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. This has been an Ace Maestro video, and I'll see you in the next one.